All right, so this screencast is all about just introducing to you Unit 5 and just sort of getting our feet wet for some of the big ideas so that we can go on and do some of the more nuanced concepts. So, this is called stabilization policies, and it's really about how the government can use policy to help stabilize the economy and promote economic growth. So, one of the things that we're excited about is that we've actually covered a lot of ground already in some of our previous stuff. So, first of all, this comes back to what are the government policies? So, you either have the choice between monetary and fiscal policy. So, if you're having a hard time remembering which is which, just remember that the word money is in monetary. So, therefore, that's the one that has to do with banking. And that fiscal policy has to do with the taxing and the spending that Congress and the president authorize. And that is through the bill making and budget making process. To go back to what the difference is between monetary and fiscal policy, you might want to draw this little chart in your notebook, or you can just sort of go through and listen to it. It's really important that you recall the who and the what. So, with monetary policy, we know that the Federal Reserve is in charge of that. There are three tools of monetary policy. There's open market operations, which is the buying and selling of bonds, the reserve requirement, which is the percentage of total reserves that banks have to keep in their vaults and they're not allowed to loan out. And then we have interest rates. And just remember that there's three types of interest rates. There's the discount rate that the Fed charges banks, there's the federal funds rate that banks charge each other, and then there's the prime lending rate that you or I would be charged if we walked into a bank. The other thing is that the Federal Reserve also has a lot of other roles in keeping the banking system stable. So, for example, regulations on loaning and ensuring deposits through a government corporation called the FDIC. That's all on the monetary side. A monetarist is somebody who would advocate this type of policy being the go-to policy when trying to encourage long-run economic growth or to fight inflation. A Keynesian might be more apt to support fiscal policy, which is controlled by Congress's power to tax and to borrow money, and also obviously the president's role in either signing or vetoing bills. Also recall that the president can institute or pass executive orders, and Congress, if you took AP Gov, you know that Congress has the power of the purse, and they're the ones that would have to fund any sort of project that a president wants through an executive order. Fiscal policy is just two tools, taxing and spending. These tools are sometimes more difficult to implement than monetary policy because, again, people who are doing these policies are elected officials that are trying to not just represent their constituents, but also become reelected. So taxing and spending can land you in many attack ads if it's not on the side of the public. And no person wants to pay more money in taxes. A new term for you that we did not cover in Unit 3 when we scratched the surface on taxing and spending is something called the federal budget. So that's something I'm going to talk a little bit about today. Fiscal policy, if you guys recall, is taxing and spending, but within that category, we have two things, and we did this in Unit 3, so this is just a quick recap. We have automatic stabilizers, and these are things that are government policies, but they automatically kick into action when needed. And some examples of these are entitlement programs or any sort of economic safety net program, for example, unemployment insurance, nutrition assistance, or progressive tax rates. So the fact that one's income can change and we already have this very systematic approach to how much will you pay taxes now, or should you lose your job, what's going to happen to you, all of those things are systematic. They can be changed. That would also take another policy, but for the most part, they're written into law and they're controlled by automatic regulations and rules. On the other side, there's the word discretionary policies, and discretionary policies are exactly what the word discretion is, to just use good judgment and implement them when necessary. And these are a huge part of the budget making process every single year in terms of the debate between Democrats and Republicans in particular. and also between states and the federal government of what's going to be funded more at the federal level versus the state level. Some examples, and by all means, are these not exhaustive lists of either of these types of spending, but provide disaster relief assistance. So, for example, if there's a hurricane, or there's a tornado that rips through a city and destroys it, if the federal government meets and decides to pass an emergency spending bill, that's an example of discretionary policy. If they decide to allocate more money into infrastructure, if they decide to devote more money to national parks, for example, or if they wanted to fund more scientific research. And I have a little typo there, my apologies. Just recall some of the concepts from Unit 3. We know that when we want to expand the economy, we would reduce taxing or increase spending, or do a combination of both. And that's going to help households and businesses have more disposable income. And we would see aggregate demand shift to the right as a consequence. On the flip side, if inflation was a problem and the economy was growing too fast and too much, we might contract the economy. And this would involve increasing taxing and decreasing spending. And again, this is trying to take away disposable income from a household or a business, and not in a punitive way, but just a way to control that aggregate demand that's lifting prices so high. We want to rein it back in a little. Also, within the category of spending, we have two things called mandatory and discretionary spending. And discretionary spending and discretionary policies, sometimes people mix those up, but they kind of mean the same thing. Mandatory spending is spending on things that by law we must spend money on. I'm just going to show you an example of that in a second, on the next slide. And also, discretionary spending are the things that members of Congress and the president ferociously debate on every early part of the year, January-ish, when they're getting ready to release the following year's budget. This is a great graphic from 2018, and I actually was looking to find something from 2019 that was comparable, but I couldn't find this exact layout. This is from the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, and the Congressional Budget Office is a nonpartisan group that basically they do something called scoring. They score the bills, and they basically say, if you pass this bill with this amount of revenue and this amount of spending, here's what's going to happen to the economy. So you'll notice that they keep track of a lot of statistics, and I'm going to use a couple of their graphics here. In 2018, outlays means how much of the money in the United States are we spending? And you can see that the blue categories here, the dark blue and gray, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, all of these things right here, plus interest, which is the money that we owe in interest on top of money we've borrowed, all of those things are mandatory spending, and they make up about $2.5 trillion of this $4.1 trillion budget. So over half of our money is already decided where it's going to go. So when Congress debates and the public opinion weighs in through the press and things like that, we're really debating about a lot of this blue area over here, which is discretionary spending. And you'll notice that it's almost just a quarter of the total spending. And you'll notice that over here it says things like transportation, education, veterans benefits, health, housing, etc. Defense spending is also part of the discretionary spending. So a lot of people think, how is defense not mandatory? It's not that it's not mandatory. Of course, we're going to spend money on defense, but it doesn't have a certain number of dollars allocated to it by law, the way that something like Social Security would, because of the way people receive benefits for Social Security. Over here, you'll notice our revenue. And where do we get revenue from? We get revenue from taxes. So, little fun fact for you, we didn't have income tax until 1913. And with the 16th Amendment. So half of our revenue comes from income tax, and that is combined. That's individual income tax, and then corporate income tax. This is really interesting to me, is this tiny little slice over here. So people that are on the conservative fiscal side would argue that lower corporate income taxes are really, really helpful for the economy because they can put money into investment. And while by and large, a lot of that is true, To me, it's astounding how small that little slice is compared to how much households are putting into our total revenue. Um, and then you'll also notice that other taxes, taxes on property, taxes on estates, meaning households, and also customs duties, that's another little portion of our revenue. And then payroll tax. This is something that people will see on their paycheck. It'll say FICA. And this is the tax that goes towards Social Security and Medicare and other entitlement programs that you saw over here in sort of that gray blue of mandatory spending. Why is this a big deal? Because our budget is something in this unit we're going to pay attention to a lot. Let me start with the middle. The middle bar here, the yellow, is a balanced budget. And I want you to think about a scale. A balanced budget means that there is the same amount of revenue coming in as there is with spending. And if you think about the previous slide, we had $4.1 trillion outlaid and we had $3.3 trillion in 2018 coming in. So that means there was about $1.2 trillion, right? Did I do that math right? No, I did not do that math right. Point eight trillion that we didn't have. So in 2018, we had what's called a deficit. And a deficit is when the revenue is not as great as the spending. And although I have this red here, and people will talk about a deficit and they'll say in the red, that just means that we have to borrow money to meet all these spending goals. So when 2018, when our revenue didn't equal our outlays, we didn't look at this budget and be like, all right, this amount of money, we just can't fund you. Better luck next time. We then borrowed money to fill the gap. And that's why this interest category will get bigger and bigger every year if we continue to borrow. And that's another conversation. That's about the loanable funds market. So that's for another time. We're just going to keep it with just budgets right here. We have a surplus when revenue exceeds spending, and really only one time in the post-war era did we have a surplus that was sustained and significant. I'm going to show you a little graphic in a second. But let me tell you this, and this is worth writing down. The United States government and state governments are not for-profit institutions. They're not businesses. So when we talk about where's the budget at? Is it in a deficit? Is it in a surplus? Is it balanced? A balanced budget or a surplus budget is not inherently virtuous, meaning just because you have a surplus doesn't mean that you're doing an effective job as a government. So these figures don't really capture the moral and ethical values that a society holds. So for example, sure, you could have a budget surplus, but you could have 17 million people that are homeless and going hungry, or 5 million people that are dying from a famine. We've decided in the United States of America that we have certain things like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, and other mandatory spending categories. So for example, nutritional assistance, unemployment insurance, benefits for veterans who are retired. We've decided those are really important things to spend money on. And if we have to go into debt to fund them, then we're going to. The problem then is the extent and the degree of that debt. And that's where we start to disagree politically. But you as an economist right now, you're not here to have the political debate. You're here to just understand that sometimes a country is going to go into a deficit and it doesn't make them inherently evil. If the country's in a deficit, if people who are retired are getting the benefits that they've put into Social Security for their career, and people who are disabled who can't work have the ability to actually live in an apartment, then maybe as a society, we're doing what we want to be doing, and that we understand that there are trade-offs. So again, fiscal policy, budgets, you got to understand the three ways that we might attack a budget or have a budget: from a balance, a surplus, or a deficit. But I want you to see that a deficit throughout US history is more common than not. And this is from the CBO as well, and it goes back to the 1960s and it projects into 2028. And I have to tell you, this is as recent as I can find. I tried to find a similar graphic from the CBO of April from 2019, and I didn't find anything I liked like this. Um, but right now in April of 2020, the projected deficits are going to be way different than what you see here projected 2 years ago, mainly because GDP didn't grow the way that the 2018 legislation predicted it would outside of having a pandemic occur in early 2020. So even before 2020 started, these projections for up into 2023 to 2028 are not accurate because of what transpired, not because this graph was flawed, but because of how real life played out. That's a projection. So when you look at this, you see that deficits happened over time, and you'll see that this dotted line around 3%, the deficits are expressed here as the percentage of the GDP. So once we get over 3%, we start to say, from an economic standpoint, perhaps this deficit's getting a little too high. One of the problems, though, is that that doesn't bring in any context. So, first of all, if you look at what happened from 2009 to 2012 when we had the so-called Great Recession, we see this huge deficit, the largest we'd ever had in US history. That doesn't mean that there was anything particularly going wrong there. In terms of policy, it just shows you that that's how high unemployment was. Because if you think about it, the revenues versus the outlays, look at all this tax revenue that's coming in 2018. Imagine if you have 10% of your populace unemployed. You're not going to get this revenue. And then on the flip side, you're going to have more money being outlaid into those transfer payments, those automatic stabilizers like nutritional assistance, unemployment insurance. All of those things are going to go up while the revenue is going down. So therefore, your deficit just gets wider and wider and wider. The total amount of money that you owe over time is referred to as the debt. Every time it gets larger, that's referred to as a deficit. So the loanable funds market is really important to all of this because where do we get the money to account for the spending from the revenue that we don't have? We have to borrow the money. So that's where the loanable funds market comes into play. And the government is a huge demander of loanable funds. So we'll cover that. We've been introduced to it in Unit 4, but we're going to dive deeper into it now with Unit 5.